There are battles that end, and then there are battles that tear holes in the fabric of what is real. Somewhere in the deep silence between universes, the echo of one such battle still trembled. A green titan had stood at the center of a dying world, his fists raised against forces no mortal mind could name. Stars had bent around him, time had stuttered, and when the final blow landed, reality itself made a sound it was never meant to make. A sound like glass breaking inside the throat of God. When the light faded, the Titan was gone. He did not arrive on the new world the way men arrive in stories. There was no ship, no portal, no warning. He simply existed where he had not existed a moment before, kneeling in a crater that he himself had carved by the act of appearing. Dust spiraled up around his shoulders, steam rose from the soil. And for a long, slow heartbeat, the green giant simply breathed. The sky above him was blue, honest blue, the kind of blue that belonged to a world that still believed in itself. He rose to his feet, slowly. Each movement was the movement of a mountain remembering it, could walk. His eyes, narrow and burning, swept across the horizon. There were no broken cities here, no corpses of dead gods, no ash. Only fields, only distant towers of glass catching the afternoon sun, only the soft hum of a civilization that did not yet know it had been visited. Worldbreaker Hulk had arrived in the Invincible universe, and the universe did not yet understand what that meant. He began to walk. The ground complained beneath him with every step, soft cracks spreading outward like veins in stone. Birds scattered from trees that had stood for centuries. A herd of animals fled across a distant ridge without ever looking back. Somewhere far away, a child looked up from her playground and asked her mother why the earth had whispered. To anyone watching from above, this world looked like paradise. Cities thrived along its coastlines. Heroes patrolled its skies. Humanity had built monuments to its own resilience, and every day they were told they were safe. Every day they believed it. But Hulk did not see paradise. He saw the thing beneath it. His senses, sharpened by lifetimes of violence, peeled back the surface of this world like a man peeling skin from fruit. He felt the trembling of small nations afraid of larger ones. He felt the hush in throats that wanted to speak and could not. He felt the long, cold shadow that stretched from somewhere beyond the stars. A shadow that touched every continent and every leader and every quiet decision made behind closed doors. Fear, control, submission. This world was not free. It only thought it was. And far above its blue sky, far beyond its moon, far past the edges of its solar system, the Viltrum Empire ruled in silence. For centuries they had moved through the galaxy the way a hand moves through water. Worlds fell. Cultures vanished. Resistance was a word that died in the mouths of those foolish enough to speak it. The Viltrumites had decided long ago what the universe was for. And the universe had not been given a vote, but the universe had just received a guest. In a quiet command center buried deep beneath the surface of the earth, an alarm began to sing. Soft at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. A man named Cecil Stedman stood before a wall of monitors and watched the data climb past every threshold his agency had ever defined. Power readings spiked past planetary, postillard, past anything his sensors had been built to measure. He did not blink. He did not breathe. He only spoke one word into the silence. Containment. But containment was already a fantasy. The Global Defense Agency classified the new arrival within minutes. Extinction level, highest tier, maximum response. Every protocol they had was activated at once, and every protocol felt suddenly, painfully small. They were not wrong about him. They were only wrong about how wrong they were. Because somewhere on a quiet field beneath a quiet sky, a green giant kept walking. He did not know this world. He did not care to. He only knew that something here was hurting. Something here was afraid. And the part of him that had never stopped being human, the small and broken part buried beneath all that rage, recognized the feeling instantly. He had felt it his entire life. Cecil did what Cecil always did when the world threatened to end. He picked up the phone. Within minutes, the Guardians of the Globe were in the air. They had answered calls like this before. A new villain. A rogue experiment. A creature from somewhere else with delusions of conquest. They had a rhythm to these things. A choreography. They believed, as heroes often do, that the shape of the threat would match the shape of their training. They were wrong. They found him standing in a wheat field. Just standing. The wind moved around him as if uncertain whether it was allowed. His back was turned to them, his shoulders rising and falling with a breath that sounded less like breathing and more like the slow grinding of tectonic plates. The team leader hovered forward. He spoke the words heroes are supposed to speak. Identify yourself. State your intentions. Stand down. Hulk did not turn around. He simply lifted his head, as if listening to a sound only he could hear, and the air around him began to shimmer with heat. The wheat at his feet curled and blackened in a perfect circle. The sky above him darkened by a single shade. The Guardians attacked. What followed was not a battle. It was a lesson. The first hero struck him with a blow that could shatter steel. Hulk did not flinch. He turned. He looked at the man the way a tired father looks at a child who has thrown a tantrum. And then he moved. Mountains, somewhere in the distance, felt it before the heroes did. A ridge that had stood for 10,000 years split down its spine. A lake emptied itself into the sky. Trees fell in a circle a mile wide, all leaning away from the green figure at the center as if bowing. One guardian was thrown so far that satellites tracked his arc across 2 continents. Another was driven into the earth so deeply that rescue teams would not find him for hours. A third tried to reason with him, to plead, to offer peace. Hulk listened. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Then the rage returned, and the hero learned that mercy from a Worldbreaker is measured in inches and seconds, not in years. High above the field, a young man in blue and yellow hovered in silence. Mark Grayson had seen monsters before. He had fought aliens, demons, machines, and men who wore the faces of family. He had watched his father break the world with a single sentence. He had stood in the ruins of his own innocence more than once. But this was different. He watched Hulk move, and a cold thought settled in his chest. This was not a creature trying to win. This was not a warrior calculating angles. This was something more honest than that. This was weather. This was geology. This was the patient and impersonal logic of an avalanche that has finally decided to fall. You cannot reason with an avalanche. You cannot negotiate with the tide. Mark descended slowly, his hands open, his voice low. He did not attack. He spoke. He asked questions. He said his name. He said the names of the people who had just been broken. He said, please. Hulk looked at him. And in that single, terrible look, Mark saw something that turned his blood to glass. Not malice, not hunger, not even anger, not really. He saw exhaustion. He saw the eyes of a being who had been hurt for so long that hurting back had become the only language he still remembered how to speak. Mark understood, in that moment, what his teachers and his father and even Cecil had failed to understand. This was not a stronger opponent. This was not a problem of power. This was a force of nature trapped inside a living body, and the body was tired, and the nature was waking up, and somewhere far above them all, an empire that had never lost was about to learn what losing felt like. Mark whispered a single word into the wind. Run. But there was nowhere left to run. The Viltrum Empire did not learn of Hulk the way mortals learn things. There were no broadcasts. No headlines, no frantic warnings shouted across crowded rooms. The Empire learned the way predators learn, through silence. A scout did not report in. Then another. Then a patrol. Then an outpost on the edge of a forgotten system simply stopped existing. In the heart of Viltrum, on a world carved by their own hands into the shape of their pride, the High Command gathered. They were beings who had been told since birth that they were the final step of evolution. They had crushed civilizations older than memory. They had silenced songs that had echoed across galaxies. They had never in all their long and bloody history been afraid. They were not afraid now, but they were curious. And curiosity, for the Viltrumites, was the closest thing they had to a warning bell. A first wave was dispatched. 5 warriors, each capable of leveling a continent, each chosen for their reputation. They descended toward Earth with the calm certainty of men who had performed this task 1,000 times before. They expected a beast. They expected resistance. They expected, at most, a brief inconvenience before the planet learned its place. They found him standing in the ruins of the field where the Guardians had fallen. He had not moved. He had not pursued. He had simply waited, as if he had known they were coming. The first Viltrumite spoke. His words were the words of empire. Submit. Kneel. Hulk smiled. It was not a kind smile. The battle that followed lasted less than 4 minutes. When it was over, 3 of the 5 Viltrumites were gone. Not defeated. Not unconscious. Gone in the way that mountains are gone after a sufficiently determined storm. The other 2 fled. They fled, and Viltrumites do not flee, and that simple fact would echo through their empire for years to come. In their fortress at the center of their world, the High Command watched the recordings in silence. They watched them again and again. They watched a being who should not exist do things that should not be possible. And they felt, for the first time in any of their long lives, the small and unfamiliar shape of a question they could not answer. What is he? It was not a question of biology. They had catalogued 1,000 species. It was not a question of origin. They had erased 1,000 worlds. It was a deeper question. A question that touched the foundation of everything they believed about themselves. If he existed, then they were not the strongest. And if they were not the strongest, then the entire structure of the universe, the structure they had built with their own hands, was a lie they had been telling themselves. A second wave was prepared. Larger, heavier, smarter. They would not make the mistake of underestimating him again. They would study him. They would surround him. They would learn his patterns and exploit his weaknesses, and bury him under so much force that the very idea of him would be erased. But beneath the strategy, beneath the cold and patient planning, something new had taken root in the heart of Viltrum. Fascination first, then concern. Then, slowly, like ice forming on the inside of a window, fear. The Empire did not speak of it. The Empire would never speak of it. But the fear was there, and it spread the way fear always spreads in places that have never felt it before. It moved through the ranks like a rumor. It changed the way warriors trained. It changed the way commanders gave orders. It changed the dreams of soldiers who had never dreamed of anything but victory. Across the galaxy, on 1,000 conquered worlds, the slaves of the Empire did not yet know what was happening. They only knew that their masters had grown quieter, that patrols had thinned, that the boot on their necks had, for the first time in centuries, lifted by the smallest of fractions. Something was coming, and the Empire, for the first time, was not the one bringing it. Mark found him at the edge of the world. The Hulk had wandered after the Viltrumites fell. He had walked for days, ignoring the cities, ignoring the armies, ignoring the small and frantic creatures who tried to study him from a distance. He had walked until he ran out of land, and then he had sat down on a cliff above a gray and endless sea, and he had not moved since. Mark hovered at a careful distance. He had been warned not to come. Cecil had ordered him not to come. The remaining Guardians had begged him not to come. Even his mother, in a voice she rarely used anymore, had asked him to stay home. He had come anyway, because Mark Grayson had spent his entire life being told what monsters were. And every single time, the truth had been more complicated than the warning. He landed softly on the cliff. The grass beneath his feet was dry and brittle from the heat of the giant beside him. He did not speak at first. He simply sat. A few feet of empty air between them, the sound of the sea below, the wind moving slowly through both of their hair. After a long time, Mark spoke. He did not ask the questions a soldier would ask. He did not ask where Hulk had come from, or what he wanted, or how he could be stopped. He asked smaller questions, quieter questions. He asked if Hulk was tired. He asked if Hulk had eaten. He asked, with the kind of clumsy honesty only the young can manage, if Hulk was sad. Hulk did not answer. Not at first. His enormous shoulders rose and fell. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. But he did not leave, and he did not attack. And in the language of beings like him, that was an answer. Mark kept talking. He told Hulk about his father, about the day his world had ended in a kitchen, with words instead of fists. He told him about Eve, about the friends he had lost, about the nights he lay awake wondering if the strength inside him was a gift or a sentence. He told him things he had never told another living soul, and he told them because something in the silence beside him felt impossibly like understanding. And then, after a long time, Hulk spoke. His voice was not what Mark had expected. It was not a roar. It was not thunder. It was low and rough and slow, like a voice that had not been used in a very long time. He spoke in short sentences, broken pieces, words like loss, words like alone, words like tired. He spoke of a small man inside him who had wanted, more than anything in the world, to be left in peace. He spoke of a green giant who had been born from that man's pain and who had never known a single day without it. He spoke of brothers and fathers and friends, and of how every one of them had eventually become a fist or a fear or a memory. Mark listened. He did not interrupt. He did not flinch. He simply listened, the way a person listens when they realize they are hearing something sacred. When Hulk finally fell silent, the sun was setting over the gray sea, and the cliff was painted in soft and impossible colors. For a moment, just a moment, Mark believed that this could end differently, that the monster could be helped, that the rage could be eased, that somewhere in the long arithmetic of pain and power there was still a number that added up to peace. He smiled. He turned to Hulk. He opened his mouth to say something hopeful, and then he saw it, a shape high in the darkening sky, then another, then a dozen, then 100. They moved with the silent precision of things that had been built for war, and they descended upon the world with the patience of creatures who had already decided how this story ended. The Viltrum Empire had finished waiting. Mark stood slowly. His hands trembled just once and then went still. Beside him, the green giant rose like a continent finding its feet. The wind around them changed. The sea below them grew quiet. The cliff itself seemed to hold its breath. Hulk looked at Mark. Mark looked at Hulk. In that single shared glance, an entire understanding passed between them. The Empire had made its decision. It would control him, or it would kill him. There would be no third path. There would be no peace. The calm was over. The storm had arrived. The sky split open. It did not split the way skies split in storms. It split the way a curtain is torn from a stage. Behind it, the Empire revealed itself in full. Fleets that stretched from horizon to horizon. Warriors that hung in the air like nails driven into the world. Banners of a civilization that had never lost, unfurling for the first time over a planet that should have been a footnote. The Viltrumites did not announce themselves. They did not threaten. They did not negotiate. They simply began. The first wave hit Earth like the closing of a fist. Cities that had stood for centuries became dust in less time than it took to name them. Coastlines rearranged themselves. Mountains became valleys. The Global Defense Agency activated every weapon it had ever built, and every weapon failed in the order it was deployed, and the silence that followed each failure was louder than the explosion that preceded it. Mark fought. Of course he fought. He moved through the sky like a comet with a purpose, throwing himself into Viltrumite after Viltrumite, buying seconds with his bones. The remaining guardians fought beside him. Adam Eve burned the air with pink fire. Rex Splode emptied himself of every weapon he could conjure. Even Cecil in his command center threw every secret he had ever kept into the meat grinder of the moment. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The Viltrumites were not an army. They were a verdict. And then, somewhere on the western edge of the battle, in a place where the ground had already given up, the verdict met its appeal. Hulk moved. He did not roar. That came later. He simply began to walk, and the walking became running, and the running became something the human eye was not designed to understand. The first Viltrumite he reached was a commander, a being who had personally erased 17 civilizations. Hulk hit him once. And the commander was no longer a commander, or a being, or a problem. The second Viltrumite saw what happened to the first. He tried to retreat. Hulk did not let him. The battle changed in the span of a single breath. Cities still fell, yes. Continents still cracked. But the falling and the cracking now had a direction. Every shockwave moved away from the green giant at the center. Every Viltrumite who flew too close was simply removed from the equation. And the Empire, for the first time in its long and arrogant history, began to do something its training had never prepared it for. It began to lose. The fighting spread across the planet. It spread into the upper atmosphere. It spread into orbit. Viltrumite warships, ships that had reduced star systems to ash, began to fall from the sky like burning leaves. Hulk leapt from one to the next, and each leap left a crater behind him, and each landing left a wreck ahead of him. He did not stop. He did not rest. He did not seem to notice the wounds opening across his body, the blood that ran green and slowed down his arms. The small and human voice in the back of his mind that had been screaming for so long it had become a kind of silence. Mark fought beside him. They did not coordinate. They did not need to. The young hero became a kind of blade in the giant's hand, a smaller and faster thing that cleaned up the edges of the storm. Where Hulk broke armies, Mark saved survivors. Where Hulk shattered ships, Mark caught the falling pieces before they hit the ground. They were not partners in the way friends are partners. They were partners in the way thunder and lightning are partners. Two halves of the same event. The Viltrumites adjusted. They always adjusted. They sent their best. They sent their strongest. They sent warriors who had been bred for a single purpose, beings whose names were spoken in whispers on 1,000 conquered worlds. Each of them arrived expecting to be the one who turned the tide. Each of them learned, in turn, that the tide had a name now, and the name was not theirs. The skies above Earth turned green with the light of impossible impacts. The seas boiled in places. The moon, far above, was struck by debris and bore a new scar that would still be visible 1,000 years later. And through it all, the green giant kept moving, kept swinging, kept refusing to stop, because somewhere deep beneath the rage, the small and broken man inside him had finally found something worth breaking the world for. Not revenge, not glory, not even survival. Something simpler. Somewhere on this planet, a young man in blue and yellow was still fighting. And the young man had listened to him. And the young man had asked, on a cliff above a gray sea, if he was tired. No one had ever asked him that before. And Hulk had decided in that quiet moment that no one ever would have to ask the young man either. They came for him at the end. The last of them, the strongest of them, the ones whose names had not been spoken in open air for 1,000 years. 3 figures descended through the burning sky. They did not wear armor. They did not need to. They were the founders, the architects, the living monuments of everything Viltrum believed itself to be. They had not fought personally in centuries. They had not needed to. The galaxy had always been kind enough to surrender before they were required to lift a hand. The galaxy was no longer being kind. Hulk met them above the broken ocean. There was no land left beneath them suitable for what was about to happen. The four of them rose into the upper atmosphere, then beyond it, then into the cold and silent dark where stars hung like distant witnesses. There were no cameras here. There were no historians. There was only the battle, and the battle would have to be its own record. What happened next would later be called many things. A war, a catastrophe, a myth. The truth was simpler and stranger than any of those words. It was a conversation. A conversation in a language older than speech, conducted with fists and gravity and the bending of space itself. Moon shattered, not metaphorically. A moon, an actual moon belonging to a nearby planet, broke into 7 pieces during the battle and would remain broken for the rest of its existence. A Viltrumite fleet that had been holding position at the edge of the system simply ceased to be, caught in the wake of a single blow that had not even been aimed at it. The sun, far away and indifferent, flickered for a moment as if blinking in disbelief. The first of the founders fell, then the second. The third lasted longer than anyone watching from afar would have believed possible, but in the end he too fell. And when he fell, the silence that followed was the loudest silence the galaxy had heard in 1,000 years. The myth of Viltrumite invincibility did not die in a single dramatic moment. It died slowly in the minds of every being who had ever feared the Empire and every being who had ever served it. It died in throne rooms and in slave pits and in the quiet places where conquered peoples had learned to swallow their songs. It died, and as it died, something else began to be born in its place. Something that had no name yet, something that felt, to those who first felt it, almost too dangerous to think about. Hope. Mark reached him as the last of the founders drifted away into the dark. Hulk was floating, slowly, his enormous body battered and burned and bleeding. His eyes were half closed. His breathing was shallow. For a long moment, Mark thought he was watching a god die. Then Hulk spoke. He spoke softly, the way a tired child speaks at the end of a long day. He did not speak of victory. He did not speak of the Empire. He did not speak of the galaxies he had just rewritten with his hands. He spoke of quiet. He said he wanted it to stop. All of it. The noise, the hurt, the voices, the endless fighting. He said he had not come here to save anyone. He said he had not come here to conquer anyone. He said he had simply been tired and the Empire had been loud and he had wanted the loudness to end. Mark listened, and as he listened, he understood at last what he had been looking at this entire time. Not a monster, not a weapon, not a force of nature. A wound. An ancient walking wound that had finally found something large enough to bleed onto. The tragedy of the Worldbreaker was not that he was too strong. It was that he had always been too alone. Mark reached out. He placed a hand on the giant's shoulder. He did not say anything. There was nothing left to say. The Empire was broken. So was the man who had broken it. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy did what galaxies always do after a great fire. It began, slowly and uncertainly, to remember what it had been before. On 1,000 worlds, the boots of Viltrumite governors were quietly removed from 1,000 necks. Songs that had not been sung in generations were sung again, hesitantly at first, then louder, then in full and trembling chorus. Children who had been born into chains went to sleep, for the first time in their lives, in homes that belonged to their parents. Old men wept in public squares. Young women looked at the sky without flinching. Statues were built, speeches were given, holidays were declared, but none of them were for him. There were no monuments to the Green Giant, no portraits hung in any hall, no festivals named in his honor. The galaxy, it turned out, did not know quite what to do with a savior who had not asked to be one. He was too large to thank, too strange to love, too frightening, even in victory, to be remembered as anything other than what he was. A storm, a thing that had passed through. Mark stood on the cliff again, the same cliff where he had once sat in silence beside a tired god. The sea below was calm now. The sky above was clean. Somewhere very far away, a green figure walked alone across a field of stars, his back turned to every world he had ever touched. Mark watched him go. He did not call out. He did not follow. He understood, in the way that only the young understand the things they will spend the rest of their lives trying to forget, that some beings are not meant to be kept. Some beings only ever pass through. And the kindest thing you can do for them is to let them keep walking. The galaxy would tell stories about this. Of course it would. It would tell them badly at first, then better, then worse again as the centuries wore on. The details would shift. The names would blur. The truth would soften into legend, and the legend would harden into myth, and the myth would eventually become something children whispered to each other in the dark when they wanted to feel brave. There was a monster, the stories would say. A monster so terrible that even the Viltrumites feared him. A monster who came from nowhere and broke an empire and walked back into nowhere when he was done. And because of him, the stories would say, we are free. The truth was smaller than that, and larger. The truth was that a tired man inside a green giant had once been asked, on a cliff above a gray sea, if he was sad. And he had decided, in that quiet moment, that the answer would be the last gift he ever gave to a universe that had never given him anything at all.